Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jesus in a Dream podcast. We believe with Jesus in a Dream, anything is possible, nothing is impossible, and the possibilities are endless. I'm Caleb. This is Zach.
Hey everyone.
We want you to enjoy life and build God's kingdom. We want you to enjoy life and build God's kingdom. Build God's kingdom. This is our first guest episode in a long time. This is Lucas Elizabeth Eaton.
Lucas Elizabeth. It's pretty close, but not quite. Luke Elliott Eaton.
Elliot, I knew it started with an E. I'm sorry about that.
And pause the episode and go watch the whole short film we did about him, and then come back. No, I was kidding.
Oh yeah, what was it called? Run for Their Lives.
It's great.
Yeah.
On YouTube. Luke, how the heck are you?
Dude, I'm doing great, man. Glad to be here. Long-time listener, first-time guest on the podcast. Excited to be here and chat with my friends.
Yes. Luke and I go way back, like 10 years now, which is kind of crazy.
That's crazy to
A
think about.
decade-long friendship. Known him since college, lived on his floor. A lot of good stuff. Let's visit the first things first. You ran an ultramarathon. We created a little video about that. Like Zach said, go back and watch that on YouTube. It's called Run for Their Lives. It's great. How'd it go?
Dude, it went well. It was fun. I don't know how much I told backstory in the short film. It's been a little while now, except for it's actually only been less than a year, which is the weirdest thing. It feels like a lifetime ago that I did it. But yeah, I've told a lot of people when I talk about it that this was one of the most clear things I've ever heard from God as I prepared for it, because I'm not a runner. You'll probably, if you watch that video, I'm not a runner, never been a runner. Don't plan to continue to be a runner, but and that's how I really know that this is something that God was like, hey, this is something you need to do. It's uncomfortable, and I love that I got to do something uncomfortable to help people that are living a much more uncomfortable life than I am. But man, it was crazy. I've never, in training, 20 miles is the longest we ever did, and 30, we get there and plan for 30, and then during the intro speech, they're like, oh yeah, we're doing a 50K, so that's 31 miles. And you don't think 1 mile is a lot at that point, but it's like, man, I would have loved to know this. And then come to find out that we're going to take a group picture, and then we're going to hop on the line right after that, after we've been sitting for 45 minutes and not get to stretch, not get to go to the bathroom, anything like that. So that was an interesting start to what I've trained for 9 months, to just jump in and be like, man, this is fun. But yeah, incredible. One of my best friends came down and we did it together, and that really was helpful in making it through that and doing it successfully. And then, I mean, even just the people that came and supported, my family, my friends. I had some of my youth students come out, and they were running with me, carrying my orange as I bit full chunks out of it and things like that, which was awesome. But yeah, it was cool to see them come and just support that as well. One of the most difficult things I've done in my life, but also like felt the reward of the obedience, like for me personally, but then also to see like the goal that I set for myself, and the goal that I really felt like the Lord was like, hey, raise $1,000. And at first it's like, I've never done anything like this where I'm just like asking people for money and asking people to support like something I'm doing. So I'm like, $1,000, that's not nothing. Like that's if a lot of people give $20, then we'll be at $1,000. But it seemed difficult, and maybe even like God would have to move for this to happen. And then come to find out, we raised over $4,000. And it's like, if you're obedient, Luke, you'll see me show up. That's all you got to do. Which, when being obedient is running 31 miles, it's not the most easy thing to do. But yeah, it was incredible. It was definitely physically challenging, emotionally challenging. I know, like, preparing for it, there was a training run. The first 20-mile run I did was in the rain, and I was crying most of that run. And it was just like this emotional battle, less physical, more emotional, of like, do I really want to do this? I could literally stop at any time, but here I am, literally raining out, 30 degrees, and I'm out here by myself, and no one else is here. And you get to experience some emotions and things that you don't experience when you're sitting in your house comfortable. So that was fun. And then, I mean, during the race, it was just like the most physically demanding thing that I've ever done in my life. Points where my calves were cramped up so bad that I wasn't sure I was going to make it another step. And at any time I could just literally fall over. But to finish and to be cheered on by people around you and just be encouraged, even by people that we didn't know, people that were volunteering to be out there and just to do that. And then to have my son out there, like excited for me, giving me a high five, nothing's better than that. So yeah, it was incredible. It was an awesome experience. Probably won't do it again unless the Lord's like, hey, you're going to do this again. And I will do it again. But for now, running is a thing of my past.
Nice. So your formal introduction can now be ultra marathon runner, faithful, obedient servant, fighter of sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, Lucas Eaton. Welcome to Jesus in a Dream episode, baby. If you're not fired up now, you don't love. Oh, okay, sorry.
What a title.
Yeah, that's cool, man.
Keep that one.
There's so much to unpack there. Real quick, if you didn't watch that video, so he ran for an organization called
30 for Freedom.
30 for Freedom. They organize runs to raise money to fight child sex trafficking. Brent Silke, amazing individual. Dude is a runner.
Yeah.
And he runs a lot.
But also wasn't a runner. When I first met him.
Because you were one of his youth leaders at Cedar Valley, weren't you?
Yep. Yeah. Served with him, which was super cool. Him and Micah Mack at the point, and yeah, super cool to kind of come around full circle and then be a part of that. So he actually spoke at a youth camp that I was at, and that's how I kind of got into it. Is we had the opportunity to run there. They had pre-sponsored dollar amounts for the amount of miles. I ran 3, thought I was going to die, and then got in bed that night and was like, man, I did it. Good job, Luke. And then the Lord's like, now you're not done. And I'm like, all right.
That's so good.
And that started the journey.
Yeah, let's unpack the journey, because I think you said a lot of good things even in that story that are like, yep, that's not just running. That's a life. That's the adventure. I think the thing that stuck out to me that I kind of want to discuss first, and then whatever you're thinking, Zach, is you said your 20-mile run in the rain, it was more emotional than it was physical. This idea that you could give up at any time, that you don't have to do this. What made you take the next step?
I mean, at that point, it was literally just, well, 2 things, really. It was the obedience, like fully knowing that God had called me to this and understanding that if I didn't take another step, that would be disobedience to what he had called me to, which, not that I'm perfect, and there's been moments where I've told God no or been disobedient to him, but in that moment, that was a driving factor. And then the second one, I mean, whenever runs got hard, whenever I had difficulty, it was just, I mean, I'd listen to music, I'd listen to this podcast, I'd listen to other stuff as I was running. But when it got hard, when it was like, I want to be done, I'd just start praying for the people I was doing it for, and just praying, man, for just that they would get to know Jesus, that they would have an experience with him, that they would be able to get out of the life that they're in right now. I'd pray for the people that put them in that place, that even their lives would be changed. They would be able to experience the grace of Jesus. They would be able to experience freedom from whatever got them in that place, and that there would just be just a greater impact for that. But I mean, it's easy to be uncomfortable in that way when you know that people are literally like living an incredibly worse life than that, and not by their choice too. Is like, I'm choosing to do this. I'm doing this because I have a choice, and they don't have a choice for the life that they're living, and they're going through something way more difficult than me. So yeah, if the Lord's calling me to it, and he's created me in a way that I can walk through hardship, I can walk through difficulty, and then be able to see what's on the other side of it, I think that's what got me through. Like, I know I'm not going to die. I know I'm not going to like just fall over on the ground and not be able to make it. Like, if I had to crawl home, I'll crawl home. But yeah, those are the 2 things for me. It's just like, again, there's not much besides like the calling to be a youth pastor. There's nothing else in my life that I've felt like a more clear, you need to do this, in my entire life, which is kind of crazy because I'm married, have kids, and this was still like obviously those things were clear decisions that I went for, but this was like, God is telling me to do this. I need to do it. So that, yeah, and just the cause for it. If it wasn't for that, I mean, there's no way. I would have gotten to 5 miles and been like, no, I'm not going to run.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
So now that you're on the other side of this, how does this change how you look at challenges in the future? Because this wasn't something that was, some people go through like traumatic challenges and it's literally like, we just wait it out. Right. And then it's just like, okay, just give it time. And then whatever's happening is over. But this is a different kind of challenge where it was like, you committed to it and then you began like the training process and you like, and I'm sure there was like the dread of the days just getting closer and closer, or if it wasn't dread, but I'm just curious, does that change how you look at tackling challenges and challenging things in the future? Like having gone through this process?
I think so. This was such a weird thing because you know exactly the day that is going to be the last thing. And it's literally just one day. And that feels so weird in the grand scheme of things. It's like, I would talk to my friend about it that was doing it with me. I'm like, dude, in like 1 week, we're going to run this and then we're going to be done. Like, it's just literally going to be over and we're not going to have to run anymore. We're not going to have to train. We're not going to have to keep track of how much we're running and things like this. So I think that's a kind of a unique experience. I mean, obviously you do face those things in your life where it's like, hey, one big decision or one big thing happens and then it's kind of over. But sometimes obviously there's residual things that follow after that. But I don't know, for me, like, I don't know how God designed and created me. I love a very specific challenge. There's like nothing more than I love, like, here's a goal to set. And it has to be like a very tangible, like run 31 miles, and then that's completed. After I did the run, I got a smart watch and it tracks your steps, all this kind of stuff, super goofy thing. But in my brain, this is the things that I enjoy, is I started running and walking and I was up to like 25,000 steps a day. And at that point, I looked on my app and it's like, hey, you're top 3% of people that take steps in the world. I'm like, well, I'm going to get 1%. I'm going to be the top 1% in steps taken. So I got to the point where after that, literally after running, so no more running, just walking, doing things in my life. I got to the point where I was doing like 31,000 steps on average, like in a week, in a day. Which got me to top 1%. It's like over 30,000 steps.
Add that to the title.
Yeah, but that's how my brain works. So tough things in my life, if it's very clear, I know I can do it. And I really enjoy that. But I need to like have that clear goal set for me, and that helps me kind of overcome it. And then once I get there, it's like, all right, what else can I do? What other difficult thing can I accomplish or challenge myself to? I struggle with stuff that isn't as clear, where it's like, oh yeah, do this or get better in this area or do this. But if I can find a goal in that area where I can set that and go for it, then, I mean, at this point in my life, I've lived long enough where I pretty much know I'm going to be able to accomplish that. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Oh, it's good. I've got another question then.
Yeah.
Does the Bible verse now, when Paul talks about I've run the race, does that take a different meaning now?
I think so. I mean,
because like it's a metaphor, but in this case, you've literally run.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think so. I think even just talking about that run where it was like so emotional, and I like literally was crying, and it's the weirdest thing to be doing physical exercise and just be like literally tears streaming down your face mixed with the rainwater that's coming down on top of you.
Sounds like a movie scene.
Yeah, it literally did. It would be cool if it was like being filmed and people were like, oh, watching this and doing it with me. But it was like one of the most lonely moments that I've ever had in my life, where it's like no one's with me. No one knows or cares that I'm doing this except for the Lord in this moment. And that was one of those moments where, like, I guess to answer your question, I'm going to run my race even if like no one else sees it. No one else cares about what I'm doing in this moment, because I know that God has something on the other side of that is going to be worth it. And if it's I raise $100 and get to see one person freed from sex trafficking, or if we raise $4,000, or if we raised $1 million, it's like I know on the other side of this, God has something for me, and being in the race and knowing that you're being obedient, there's going to be something great at the finish line. So I think that's what that would be for me. I mean,
I'll say one more thing, I'll let you go. But that's something that we talk about a lot, is like that moment when no one's watching, and like how that is so, it's an important thing because that's what God cares about. Because in that moment, it's like you said, it's you and God, and it's like, and God's the only one watching what's going on. And it's like, if you turned around and walked away, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know that you were even outrunning, or that you changed it, or like, hey, I said I ran 20, but I ran 1, or something. Like,
absolutely.
But like, and I think that's just, I don't know. Yeah, that's just something that we talk about a lot, is like, because we did a worship night, and that was just the clear thought that I had, is like, we're down, because it was the first thing we did in the studio, was we did a worship night. And I was like, nobody knows we're here. We're literally like in the basement of a building, and we're worshiping God, and like, we're not live streaming it. There's only like 8 people here. It's like, that doesn't matter. It matters that like we're doing this for God. And so there's nothing extra there, where there's no like, hey, but actually you're getting funding for this, or something like that.
Absolutely.
Like,
that's such a cool
there's a
thought,
talent
though.
scout in here somewhere,
Absolutely. That's such a cool thought to think, though. Like, how small am I that I did this and it happened, and how cool is that, whatever. But the fact that there's people around the world, like Christian people, doing awesome stuff like this in a basement, recording a podcast that maybe there's not 1 million listeners, but there are listeners, and there are people being affected, and there's millions of other people that are doing not this, but something similar, where they're saying, hey, I'm just going to be obedient to God. And I mean, that's kind of the whole My Mountain, like, what is it for you? But it's cool to think about, and encouraging to think about that, like, in those moments when you feel alone, in those moments when you feel like you're the only one doing it, in those moments where you're alone with God, like, there's other people alone with God right now, like, doing something difficult, uncomfortable, and is going to lead to something incredible, which is, I don't know, that's an encouraging thought to think about.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that idea, because I think, well, let me break it down. Doing it alone is great for you individually. Like you said, I think that's an important piece of our faithfulness to God, is when we're in those moments. I've had those moments too, where it's like, I feel so lonely in this, and I'm in this position because I said yes. It's not like I'm in this position because I made a mistake, or somebody forced me, or I'm in sin. Like, I'm doing something hard. It is painful. And it's almost confusing. I don't know if you felt this like in that moment, but like I think back to my moment of like loneliness, crying, and I'm going, God, like, why am I here if I said yes? And like, or why does it feel like this if I said yes? Like, and those moments are so important, I think, to look back on and see God with you in that situation, God doing it, knowing that you're the only reason you're doing it, because you're not doing it for any other reason than because God told you to. And I think being able to go back to those moments is so important for the future, because then that moment can never be taken away from you, of like, that was me and God, and it sucked, but it was also so wonderful. And then the other side of things, of what you're talking about here, is like, what's done in the dark will be brought out into the light. Like, Jesus says that, like, what is whispered in the dark. And I think sometimes we look at that and go like, oh, he's talking about exposing like corruption, no, he's talking about like the prayer closet. He's talking about your relationship with God. He's talking about the basements and the hidden pieces. And one of the things that I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I think is a great example of this, is Joseph in prison. And, he interprets the dream, and then he says, like, don't forget me. And he's in this hole in the wall, and he's in this basement, he's in this prison, and it takes 3 years. And Joseph didn't know when the conversation between the cupbearer and Pharaoh was happening. And I heard this sermon, years ago, that was talking about, like, when you obey God, people will talk about you in rooms that you've never been in before. And this idea that, like, he got invited into the palace because of what he did in the prison. And, sometimes I think there's so many things, not even sometimes, I think most of the time we'll never hear about it on this side of heaven, like what our impact truly is. And like, it's cool, even with this podcast, it's like, you're right. Like, we don't have millions of listeners, but I am so surprised whenever like I'll see somebody and they'll be like, saw your clips, listen to the podcast. This is how it changed. I was like, you didn't like that. You didn't comment on it. You didn't share it. I didn't even know you were listening, but they're talking about how it impacted their lives. And I think that is the kingdom, is half of the kingdom is hidden. And then half of it is God's full glory on display through his people. And I think that's a really cool dynamic because I think we need both of those things. One thing I wanted to talk about is, you know, on the podcast, or just how we live our lives, or how we try to live our lives. You live your life in this way too, is like, we want to live it in the tension. We don't want to fall into any ditches of extremes, as Ecclesiastes says. And something that is so evident in this story of you running the marathon is, I think a lot of people fall into the ditch of like, if it's God's will, he'll do it. And like, I don't have to do anything, and it's all him, and like, he'll use me if he wants to use me. And then there's the other ditch of, I need to do everything myself. I need everything in my control. I need to make things happen and all this stuff. And here in this story, you clearly see the tension of like, God wants to move and he wants to partner with his people. And part of that partnership is us having a mindset of, we are going to get this done. And what I wanted to discuss is, I think there's a little nuance to this, but I think a lot of people talk about mindset. A lot of people talk about focus. Like, if you want to get your goals done, have a winner's mindset, have a champion's mindset, like elevate your thinking and all of that stuff. And while I agree with that to an extent, I think there is an element of, but it's with God's faithfulness. You get to run this race. And when you are running, maybe God did step in sometimes to like give you strength and you didn't feel the pain in your legs. But most of the time, like, you were in pain, you were doing the hard thing, and then you got to watch God move. Maybe talk a little bit on that, of like, what does that look like for people when they are trying to be obedient to God, when they're trying to chase their dreams and passions that they believe God gave to them? How do you stay in the tension of letting God do what he needs to do, but also doing my responsibility in it?
That's good. As you're talking about that, I'm just thinking about one of my favorite passages in scripture is John 10:10. It talks about how the thief comes, kill, steal, and destroy. But Jesus came to give us life to the full. And a lot of times we read that and it's like, oh yeah, blessings, blessings, blessings. But life to the full, even as we see how Jesus lived, doesn't mean just blessings. It doesn't mean good things. Like, to the full is something much more than living life happy, living life this, but actually getting to experience all of those things. And I try to live my life that way, and I try to share that obviously with my youth group and stuff, that God wants us to live a full life, and that doesn't mean an easy life. It doesn't mean like one that we can coast through. It doesn't mean one we can be comfortable in, but it's one that we can live to all of the stuff that he's created us to do. And I think in the run, it's just allowing that to happen and being able to experience all of those things, and whether that be the emotions, the difficulties, but then walking through understanding that like the Lord's with you in all of that. I don't know. It's a tricky thing. But I think honestly, that's the biggest thing for me, is just like, God didn't create us to have life easy. He didn't create us to have this terrible life. He created us to feel and experience all of that. And I think that's where that tension comes from. It's not like, hey, you should lean one way, you should lean the other way. Like, you're going to experience all this, and you need to trust me in every area of those lives. Like, he's going to bring us to the mountains, and we're going to walk through the valleys, and we're going to be able to deal and experience with that. I was just thinking, I don't know, every morning in the shower, it's like, that's when I have the thoughts that I enjoy the most in my life, because I'm just like, just waking up, hopping in the shower. And usually I just start out just like praying in the shower. I don't do much. I just like hop out of bed and get right to it. But I was just thinking about this morning, and I don't know if this speaks directly to what you're talking about, but it was just an interesting thought that I shared with my wife too, is that that Jesus, before he goes to the cross, he weeps and he asks the Lord, like, hey, if you can, take this cup from me. Like, I don't want to do it. This is difficult. This is hard. This is an experience that I don't want to experience. But he did that fully knowing and understanding the other side of it already. Like, he knew he was going to rise again. He knew that he's God. He knew what he was doing it for, but it was still difficult, and he still experienced that. And I don't know, that was just like a revelation to me this morning that as Christians, we know that we're going to have the victory. We know that God's already won. We know that he has better things for us in eternal life. We know all of this. But to see that Jesus also still felt these feelings, dealt with this difficulty, like lived in that tension that you're talking about of, man, God, but is this really the only path? Is this really the only way? Is this really the only thing that I can go through so I can get to that point? But I think reading that and seeing that, if Jesus did it, I feel like it's okay for us to do it. And that's my goal as a Christian, is to model my life as much as possible like Jesus. And I think that just shows us, like, he's such a personal God that he will go through this. He will reveal it. I don't think anything in Scripture is there by accident, that it's like, this isn't an important detail. But seeing that and saying, hey, created in your image, I'm going to walk through this. I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to deal with moments where even that I know on the other side of this, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be fine. It's going to maybe even be better. I'm going to have to walk through this to get there. It's kind of like, spoiler alert, it's going to be great, but you still have to do this. It's not like God's like, all right, I know you're going to rise from the dead. I know it's going to be incredible. So I guess let's just skip this whole part. Like, you don't have to go to the cross, but there's so many great things after, and we're allowed to feel and deal with these things in the moment, where it then leads us to this great thing that God has for us. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
that's a great revelation, and thank you for sharing for that. And I think that does answer the question. And I think it also brings up a good point that, like, you're right, like Jesus knew, I'm just going to use this language, had the vision of he's going to rise from the dead. On the third day, he's rising from the dead. However, the time between that, like the time between Friday, or let's say Thursday night, and Sunday morning is very difficult. And I think we can, expand that to, our lives. Is like when God shows us the happy ending, the vision, the dream, the mountaintop, all of that stuff, he understands that, like, what it takes to get us there is important. And although he could, say the word and we would be wherever he wanted us to end up, he knows that the journey, is what refines us, sanctifies us, makes us more like him, models our lives after Jesus, so that other people can model their lives after us, all of those good things. And I think that's also the point where, like, the frustration, like, we see Jesus, sweating blood, anxious, like, he's at this place where it's like, I know this is going to be hard. And I think I love that you said he's allowed to do that, and therefore we're allowed to do that, and knowing, like, in the middle, in the valley, we can have these moments that are not, ideal, I guess. Yeah. I don't know if that's the right word, but but even in those moments, when we're honest with God, he uses those moments to, for our benefit, for our good, and all of those things. And so, I think that's a great revelation. I think, to the point of, my question of, like, do we allow God to do everything, or do we do everything ourselves? Like, that is a perfect answer of, like, we look to what Jesus did, and Jesus went to the cross, he obeyed the Father, and he got the reward of his obedience.
Yeah. I'm going to circle back really quick to another. So I had this thought, this was back on when we were talking about, like, when you were, like, running alone. And I'm also thinking, like, because the part that Jesus, like, the leading into it, like the moment before it even all started, seemed almost just as difficult, as the moment, because
talking about the garden.
Yeah.
The garden.
And so it's like, and I was thinking about that because, like, when you're talking about, like, you're leading up to the run, and it's like that moment before, you're probably thinking, like, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do this. And then, like, when you're actually running, it's like, we just continue running. Yeah. And I feel like that's with Jesus as well, is it's like that moment. And then once it all starts and it's just like, now we just continue. And I think there's something to be said maybe there of just like when you're like, yeah, in that moment of like following what God's called you to do, just be like aware that's like, hey, once you get started, you just continue. And it's like sometimes that like beginning phase when you're like, this is so hard. It's like, yes, it is, but it's also hard to like stand and look at it, because I feel like it's like once you're in it, then it's like we just continue, and then it's not as scary. But the other thing I wanted to say was like, just my thought was like changing when we were talking about, right, if people are watching or if God's watching, excuse me. And I was like, had this thought just then, and I was like, why don't we ever like say, I'm not going to do this unless God's watching? Like, what if that was a phrase that we said? And it's like, cause right, like it's always, oh, God's going to like see it when you're sinning or when you're, you know, lying about people. God's going to hear that. And it's this kind of like, he's everywhere. He's watching you and he's like going to get you, you know, but it's like, what if it's the other way around, as we're like Christians trying to do the right thing? And it's like, okay, there'll be a million, like you're going to be on TV doing this run and everyone's going to watch and you're going to raise $10 million and you'll be like, awesome, but is God watching?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, I don't know. I've never heard that phrase said. And I want to start saying that, because it's like, because in that moment where you are running alone, I just keep thinking of that. And it's like, God is watching. And it's like, who else could be worth more to you watching that than like God watching? You know what I mean? And it's like, why? I don't know. I've never thought of things that way. And I'm just like starting to think of that now. And I just really like that idea of like, is God watching me do this? And if he is he like proud of this and he cheering me on? Because that's what matters. Right. And I don't know. It was just like a thought change that happened like halfway after that conversation, but
yeah,
bringing it back there. But, but yeah, any thoughts on that or different questions that you guys have?
I mean, obviously I think God's watching everything we do, but I mean, obviously that question is for us to kind of come to an understanding of that he is. I mean, we can go through our day to day and just kind of keep moving with life, doing our thing, whatever that may be. But I think to a point there is, thinking about my son, I have 2 kids, 3-year-old and a 6-month-old, and there's nothing more that my 3-year-old loves is to show me what he's doing. Like, like, Dad, come check this out. Dad, come look at this. Dad, come do this. He wants me to be a part of all of it. And I think for me, I mean, becoming a parent, there's just so much, in my belief, there's such a better understanding of me and like God the Father and how we interact with him and how he loves us, and living our life in that way of like, God, I want you to see this. Obviously, he already sees it, but like having excitement for that instead of, oh man, I want my 10 friends to see that I'm doing this, or I want my social media following to see that I'm doing this. I feel like sometimes we can fall into that trap of, hey, if only this person could see it, only this person could see it. But if we went back to just such a basic idea of, Dad, I hope you see this. Dad, I hope you see what I'm doing here. And not in like a proud way, but like, you had something for me and I want to do it and I want you to see that. And I think he is proud of us in those moments, and he is like, he awards obedience. Obviously that looks a million different ways, and some people can hear that and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to be obedient so I get blessed in financial ways and things like that, and that's just silly. But it's like every time my son builds a tower with Legos, I don't give him $5. It's like I go over and I love on him, and I'm like so thankful for him, and I'm excited for him. And yeah, I think just that view of, man, God, Dad, like, look at what's going on here. Look at what you're doing through me. Look at what I get to do because of you, is a really cool mindset to live in. And I mean, it's really humbling though. You have to come to a point where it's like everything else doesn't really matter. And as long as I please God, then he's going to do the rest, kind of thing. So it's definitely a difficult mindset to live in, but it is really cool, I think, when you are in that point where nothing else matters.
I think you brought up something really cool that I want to explore right now or expand upon. That idea that when Jace, your son, when he does something for you, one, he's not looking for financial compensation. And two, that is not the first thing that is on your heart and on your mind. And I love that because I think it reframes, like, this is something we've been talking about the last like 2 or 3 episodes. And like even today, somebody commented on one of my reels, like I said, like godliness has benefits for this life and the life to come, quoting 1 Timothy 4. And somebody commented, well, what do you mean benefits? And I think that is something that, we just have to reframe our mind around, where like benefits can mean finances, like God provides.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that is like what Paul was talking about, is like it holds value for all things. Like godliness has value for all things. And when we do things for the Father, when we're obedient to the Father, God adds value to our lives. And like you were saying, that looks a lot of different ways. But I want to focus on this finance part, because I think that is something that like us as human beings, like we need sustenance to live. Like that is part of life. We need food to eat. We need a roof over our heads. We need clothes to wear. And Jesus like addresses this and says like, do not worry. And I think that's such an easy thing to quote, but it's like, okay, we worry. So let's look at a story here. And I love that you used the story of Jace building, but I want to look at the story of the prodigal son for a second, because the latter half is about the older brother who rarely gets press time, and that's sad for him. But, he gets upset. The older brother gets upset when the younger brother comes home and the father throws a party for him. He cooks the fattened calf and all this stuff, and the brother says, he's sitting outside the party, and father comes out, who is God, or who's God in the story, and he says, why are you upset? And he said, well, I've been doing all of these things for you, yet you have not financially compensated me. Basically is what he says. He says, you haven't even slain like a goat for me to have a party with my friends. And the father responds as the father's heart responds to, as a natural father would respond to his kids, of, you already have everything that I have. But that's something that the son did not see, because of his own relationship issues with his father, I think. We don't get into Jesus doesn't get into that, but I think that's the only thing that can be said about that is, although the older brother did everything that his father asked him to, he didn't have enough relationship with him to know that everything that was his father's was his. And I think that's so important for us as Christians, as children of God, to look at God and know, I'm going to be obedient, not because I need any reward for it. I don't need financial compensation. I don't even need these benefits that are promises, that are gifts anyway. I know I'm going to get them, and that's wonderful, but that's bonus, because I know everything that's the Father's is already mine. And so what's on my mind is now not my needs, because I know my needs are already taken care of, and I'll be blessed, and I can have access to everything God owns. And if we come at it with that mindset, then we don't have a mindset of scarcity, of like, how am I going to get fed today? What am I going to wear today? What Jesus is saying, like, don't worry about those things, because God already has those things figured out. You can approach it as like, I'm living in my Father's house. When I build the Lego house because like God wants to play Legos with me, I'm not building my thing and then holding out my hand. Because I'm already in a house where I'm well fed, I have everything I need. I know that's really hard for us as adults to like wrap our heads around. But you have to understand that you in God's eyes, you are a child. You are a 3-year-old child, and God is not going to neglect you how we sometimes think he does. So anyways, that was a very long point, but I love that you brought that up, and then I just want to apply scripture to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's super good. We actually just talked about that story this past week at church. And it's interesting because talked about the older brother and talked about how there wasn't really ever like a request for it. He just kind of like expected that and wanted his father to like see that and give it to him. But if he would have only asked, like, there's so much more. And I think we can find ourselves in that sometimes, is we just like go through hard things, we deal with difficult things, and we kind of put ourselves in a place where we're alone. we say, well, God, on the other side of this, you'll be there for me. On the other side of this, you'll bless me. On the other side of this, you'll answer my prayer or whatever you're trying to do. But in the midst of it, it's like, he's still with us. He wants to be with us. He wants to be there. And that's why I think, like, even again, going back to Jesus in the garden, when he's inviting the Father in and saying, God, I want you to be a part of this conversation. I'm not trying to do this alone. I'm not trying to walk through this alone, but I want you to be here with me. And I think that's such a trap. Maybe the enemy uses isolation is like weapon number one, is like, hey, you are alone in this, and maybe you'll get out the other side and then be able to be connected with God again. But no, he's with you literally that whole time. And that's like the piece that in that story, the prodigal son is obviously separated from the father and he comes back to him. But the older son is literally in the same house with him. And like you were talking about, has food to eat, didn't recognize that, has all of this other stuff. Like, I'm sure he was, if this was a real story, was living pretty well for the father that he had. But what he missed out on is that there was even more that he could have went after, that he could have asked for, that he could have sought out in that moment. And like,
can I interrupt you real fast? Because I just realized something too about this story is we know enough about the father to know that if he had asked, he would have given it to him. Not just because he says it at the end, but because he does it at the beginning with the younger brother.
And that's what we talked about at church. It's like, if the younger brother literally asked for his whole inheritance, do you think the character of the father would have changed that much in that time, that he would not have given a goat? But it was because he didn't ask, that he didn't receive what he had for him. And that's the point I'm trying to get at, is that, man, we got to go after the things that God has for us. Sometimes we as people like sell ourselves short and also diminish the power that God has for you. And again, it's not always going to be financial benefit, but there is just like so many other great blessings. Even the scripture, I don't know the reference off the top of my head, but where it talks about tithe is that, hey, test me in this and I will bless you. It doesn't say test me in this and give your money and I will give you money back, but it says I will bless you. And I mean, I've seen that play out over and over and over and over again in my life, where it's like, maybe it wasn't money that was returned, but like God did something else incredible in my life. And I really believe that if I wasn't obedient in that area, then I probably wouldn't have seen him move in this way in my life. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting point looking at that story and hearing, man, God has so much for us. And if we would just ask, if we would just live in the place of a child where we're saying, God, I want what you have for me. And I think about my kid too. It's like, dude asked for a lot of snacks and he knows I have snacks, and I'm not going to randomly just be like, oh, you want a snack? Maybe every once in a while, but for the most part, it's like he asks. And as a father, I want to bless him. I want to give him what I have. I have these resources and who I am to give back to him. And it's cool to see him then be able to receive that. But I got a lot of snacks. God's got a lot for us. It's like, if we would just ask, he has so much more than we can ever imagine. And again, it's not just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to ask God for everything and he's just going to bless me in the way. Because we have such a limited mindset on that I think that's where people really struggle. It's like, I know what's best for me, and we don't know what's best for us. Because if I knew what was best for me, it wouldn't be running 31 miles. It'd be doing something totally different than that. But little did I know that there was such a greater reward that's bigger than myself in that. And we have a lot of times such a limited mindset to only ourselves and the impact that something's going to have only on ourselves, versus, hey, there's eternal benefit and things that can come from this. And also there's just like such an impact that it can have on other people besides myself. So
I'm going to jump in and say, I think we just circled back to your question of what is the tension between like being, or just like when the people say, if God's going to do it, he's going to do it. And I'll just like work really hard. And I think both of those were the case with the second brother, because he just worked really hard. But then he also just waited. If God's, if Father's going to throw me a party, he's going to throw me a party. And and it never happened. And he's like, what's up with that, God? Come on. And like that. And I think that's like what you just said, like, you got to ask for it and you have to go after it. And like, I think that's the activity.
Mm-hmm.
That's not I'm just going to work super, super hard and like bring these things into existence, because that was like, I think both of those happened. Yeah. With the second brother, he just worked really, really hard and was just like, come on, do you notice me? Did you notice me? Are you going to throw me a party? I know you want to throw parties. And it's like, I know you want to bless me. Where's the blessing? But he like, yeah. And that's where like the relationship was clearly like missing there in some way, where it was like misunderstanding. But yeah, I think that's the tension is,
it's good.
Is you can work and you can know that God's going to do what God's going to do based on his character. But then you also like that middle, the dot in the middle is asking.
Mm-hmm.
And which means if you're asking, you are in relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's conversation. It's not just
so
like
yeah.
waiting for, the bonus to come through the mail. That's not a relationship thing.
That's good.
Like, but yeah.
That's so good. Yeah. I mean, just quick thinking about running again. During that difficult run, it would have been so easy for me to just work and try to do it in my own strength. And in my head, have an understanding that God's with me. He called me to do this. Of course, he's going to be with me. But it's a very different thing of me doing that versus actually then, again, I love that idea of actually being in a relationship and actually having a conversation with him in the moments of struggle, in the moments where we face difficulty, in the moments where we are uncomfortable. It's so important that we invite God into that, where it's not just like, God, I know you're here. I have an understanding of that. But it's a difference between having just an understanding and actually inviting him into that situation, because, I don't know, he's not intrusive in the way that it's like, oh, let me come just fix the pain that you're going through. Like, we live our lives in relationship with him, and it'd be weird if he just constantly was like, let me fix that without you asking. Let me do this without you asking. Let me do this. Because, again, thinking about, I think there's a reason why we have kids and we can do that. And I think it is something that can teach us. But if I just did that to my son every time he struggled to build a Lego tower, I just came in and said, all right, let me do it for you. Let me fix this for you. Let me do this. But if he asks and says, Dad, I need your help with this. I can't connect this one piece. I want you to come and help me out with it. Of course I'm going to go and I'm going to help him out with that.
Because if you rush in every time, he will never learn how to build a Lego tower.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's good. I'm going to ask you, it might be a difficult question, but I think it's worth asking. Talking about when you're talking about life to the full and blessings coming in different forms and all of that stuff. And I think extension of that, answers to prayer coming in different forms. And like you said, we imagine ways that God can intervene and help us. And often, especially if you don't have a relationship, it can be very surprising how that happens.
Yeah.
Even if you do have a relationship, it can be very surprising because you have an idea of like, oh, well, if I was going to do it, this is how I would do it. I want to ask you, your 30-mile run and you hearing from the Lord, if you can take a second and think about this, but how was that an answer to prayer of maybe a desire of your heart, like over the years? And while you think, I'll give an example of like for myself. Several years ago, 2017, I started praying this prayer of, God, don't give me an easy life, give me a great story. And I thought it was just kind of like a good thought and like all of that stuff, but I kept writing it in my journal and I believe I meant it. And these past now it's been 7 years, because it was the summer of 2017 after I graduated, I have seen how God has moved in that time and time and time again. And even to the point where, like, when I was praying that, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't know where I was going. I was just trying to be obedient to the Lord. I was a youth pastor at the time and all this stuff. And now, like, fast forward to right now, it's like, oh, God was not only writing my own story, but he's also given me stories to tell of like other people. And like, that's what we're doing now with like My Mountain and The Wire and like all of these other things. And I'm like, wow, that is really cool, Lord. And what I've also learned about storytelling is, and I think I knew it then, that's why I wrote it the way I did, was like, don't give me an easy life, give me a great story, is because great stories have difficulty, challenge, adversity, giants, mountains, all these things that you have to overcome. And the way the Lord has answered that prayer are just all ways that, like, in my own human wisdom, I would have never been able to even write the story. So like for you, it's like, man, you're saying some really cool things here that honestly are so inspiring me. Like you heard the word of the Lord clearly, like you did something you never thought you would do. Like you raised all of this money. Like, can you trace back maybe an indirect prayer sometime in your life or a desire of your heart at some point in your life that maybe led you to that moment that like God honored?
I mean, I think back to even just one of the other most clear callings I've had in my life is to youth ministry. And that happened when I was pretty young. Growing up, I had pretty earthly desires. I was pretty gifted in math and science and thought, hey, I'm going to be an engineer someday. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to live a comfortable life was honestly the thought that I had. But as I started attending a church, attending youth group, as faith became my own and wasn't just something that at 8 years old, I said yes to following Jesus, probably for the 10th time, but the first time I remember, started attending and like actually making it my own and coming to an understanding of, well, if I'm going to live this thing out, I don't want to live it in this comfortable way of, I already had this plan coming into it and I'm going to just live out this plan that I've come up with. I mean, sometimes not wrong. Obviously, there were giftings in there that I believe that God gave me to, first of all, have that idea for it. But I think for me, it was just coming to the place that literally at an altar, and I mean, this might be pretty cliche if you're from a church background, but literally...
It's cliche because it's true.
Exactly. At the altar, at a youth camp, I mean, just praying, like, God, what would you have for me? What do you have for my life? Like, I want to do just literally a prayer of obedience, like whatever you want me to do. And it really was like almost a sacrificing of this plan that I already had of saying, God, if this isn't it, if being an engineer, if using math and science, if doing this, which, man, thinking back, if I was doing that now, that'd be so boring. But kind of offering that up as like almost a sacrifice, like, here's my plan. Could you show me yours? Like, here's what I have. This is my idea. I think I could do this and it would be comfortable. But what do you have for me? And like in that moment, so clear that I want you to love on the next generation. I want you to be a youth pastor. I want you to share what you've experienced, share this relationship that you have with me, with other people. And I mean, full circle, back at another youth camp, talking about running. Again, not something that I didn't come into this running at all. Literally, my first run after the camp was like a mile long, and it wasn't easy. It was tough. But in that moment, it was in my bed. It wasn't like God woke me up out of my sleep, and it was this super spiritual moment, which if he does that for you, awesome. But it was literally just me in bed before going to bed. No better way to fall asleep than praying. Literally just praying, like, God, this was awesome today. Like, I loved what you did. Like, how cool that all these people ran. How cool that this message was shared. How cool that people are going to be rescued out of sex trafficking because of today. But also something in me was praying, what now? Like, what else? And I don't remember the specific words if it was that, like, what else do you have for me? What else do we do? And I mean, there was this internal tension of like, I kind of almost already knew, like, before that moment of praying. And it's like, this doesn't feel complete. And I could go on and I could, thinking back, live the life of an engineer and it'd be okay. But there would be this moment of disobedience to kind of get there, which would have been a struggle. And just in that moment, like, what do you have for me now? And in that moment, it was so clear that it was like, you're not done with this. Like, this running thing wasn't just for today. There's like so much more to that. And I think sometimes we can be challenged by the Lord in that, where it's like we do have that feeling of like, maybe this wasn't it. Maybe this isn't all that God had for me in this area. But I think it takes moments in our life where we do have prayers like that. Like, I don't want to live a comfortable life, but I want to tell great stories, and praying that prayer of, God, send me. God, what do you have for me? I want the life to the full. And that verse is really, I've never really thought about it like this, but like a life verse, whatever, but just that simple, like, live life to the full is such a challenging thing, because it puts us in a spot where we can't offer that to ourselves. We can't offer a life of to the full by ourselves. And I think about, like, if I would have followed my own plan, that would have been an empty life. That would have been a life that would maybe have been comfortable. Obviously there would have been hardships and things like that, but it would have really been empty, because I created that for myself, and I'm not as good of a creator as He is. And He created me with a purpose, with a plan, and with things that He has for me. But it's coming to a point of being open to that and willing to say, God, what do you have for me now? Like, what else do you have for me?
All of that is super good. I got to pee super bad. This is the end of the episode. Love you guys. He's on again in the next episode, so watch it. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll see you guys later.